Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Nicaraguan Migration, Myths and Reality. I will now repeat this in Spanish. Saludos a todas y todos. Bienvenidos al webinar de Nicaragua de hoy, titulado Migración Nicaragüense, Mitos y Realidad. Before we start, let's make sure everyone can access interpretation if you need it. Please look at the bottom of your screen and find the interpretation button. It's the one with the globe icon. Click on interpretation, then select the language that you want to hear. Antes de empezar, vamos a asegurarnos de que todo el mundo puede acceder a la interpretación si la necesita. Busque en la parte inferior de la pantalla el botón Interpretación con el icono del globo. Haga clic en Interpretación y seleccione el idioma que desea escuchar. Starting now, I'll speak only in English, with gratitude to our two interpreters, Jill Clark-Golub and Camilo Mejia. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'll serve as co-moderator today. We're very pleased to hear from two knowledgeable speakers, John Perry and Lenin Munguía, followed by questions and answers. We'll introduce our speakers at greater length in a few minutes.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm Michelle Manjanat, also co-moderating today. I am a union member and internationalist based in New York, and also a member of Friends of the ATC, or the Rural Workers Association in Nicaragua. Today, I'd like to thank Eduardo Zevallos, who co-organized today's event, Yoav Elenevsky, who is providing our technical support, and Lucy Murphy, who is hosting Lenin Munguía during the webinar. We also thank our many organizational co-sponsors who are being listed now in the chat. While we are updating the chat settings, we do have a few requests and announcements. You will see several buttons available at the bottom of your screen. One button is for closed captions. Just click it to turn it on. Also, feel free to use the chat function to offer comments throughout the event. But if you have a question for the speakers, please do not put your question in the chat, or we may not see it. Instead, please click the question and answer button and place your question there. After we hear both presentations, we'll select your questions from the Q&A to pose to the speakers. Also, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants within the next few days. When it's ready, it will also be posted at nicasolidarity.net and on the YouTube channel of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition.
If you'd like to become more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing foreign interference there, please join the International Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. You can check the website regularly at nicasolidarity.net. Also, please put your name and email address in the Q&A if you'd like to receive action alerts, the weekly newsletter, and monthly meeting notices. The next meeting of the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition is on Monday, December 11th. An important organization in our movement is Alliance for Global Justice, or AFGJ.org. AFGJ and its fiscally sponsored projects are under serious attack by right-wing media, which have managed to block their credit card donations. You can learn more about this funding crisis at the main page of their website, afgj.org. You can also register for their virtual fundraiser to be held on December 17th at bit.ly/AFGJ25. To save as much time as possible for this program, we'll enter some other information in the chat as soon as we can about other ways that you can get involved or learn more about Nicaragua. And now we turn to our invited speakers. Our first speaker is John Perry, originally from the UK, who has lived in Masaya, Nicaragua for over 20 years. He writes about Central America for many publications, including The Nation, London Review of Books, Monthly Review, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, and Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. He also continues to work on issues relating to housing and migration in the UK for the Chartered Institute of Housing, at which he was policy director until 2003. Welcome, John. You have the floor.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to share my screen. I hope that works okay. Thanks, Barbara. I'm going to talk about Nicaraguan migration. I'm going to talk about the myths about it and what I think is the reality. And what I'll do is try to address a number of detailed issues against the background of claims that 1 in 10 people have fled Nicaragua and that they've done so because of repression in the country. So I'll talk about what the opposition sources are claiming. I'll talk about the global figures for displaced Nicaraguans. And I'll also talk separately about migration to Costa Rica and to the United States, and focusing perhaps more on the United States. The reasons people are migrating there, the current humanitarian parole arrangement. I'll give an example of one migrant journey, and Lenin, I'm sure will speak more about that when he speaks. And very briefly talk about Nicaragua as a country of transit for migrants before returning to the question of whether large-scale migration from Nicaragua is myth or reality. Well, we start with what opposition sources claim, and it's convenient here to quote from Ada Peralta, who spoke on NPR on the Sunday Story program in September. And he said that 600,000 people have fled Nicaragua because of constant turmoil in a country where politics has taken over every aspect of life. And for him, the crucial date after which Nicaraguans began to flee was the middle of 2018, when a violent coup attempt took place that led to the deaths of more than 200 people. And of course, we talked about that in previous webinars, so I won't focus much on that today. But we need to know where these figures come from. And they come largely from opposition sources. One principal one is from the Inter-American Dialogue, where a former Nicaraguan, Manuel Orozco, claims that almost 600,000 Nicaraguans left the country between 2019 and 2022. And some of the NGOs now based in Costa Rica, including within them one called Nunca Más, say basically the same figure. They say that 605,000 Nicaraguans have left. In their case, they say they've been forcibly displaced. And very recently, just in the last few days, a new survey came out, again from an organization like the Inter-American Dialogue, which is funded by US government sources like USAID. And they looked at migration intentions across Latin America. And they asked a question: do you have intentions to go live or work in another country in the next 3 years? And supposedly 50% of Nicaraguans who were asked the question had such intentions. And this was 30%. This had gone up from 30% in the same survey, which had been held in 2018. But there are several problems with these figures. One is that if really in 2018, 30% of Nicaraguans intended to leave, why didn't they leave? Because the maximum number that left within 3 years of 2018 was 5%. So clearly that 30% figure was an exaggeration. And so we might suppose that the 50% figure is also very exaggerated. The survey is also based on a sample of only a few hundred Nicaraguans. We don't know how many, but it can only be a few hundred because there are only a few thousand surveyed across the whole of Latin America. The survey ignores the fact that so many Nicaraguans, as I'll explain in a moment, migrate temporarily to Costa Rica. And if the whole survey were true, if really 39% of Latin Americans are going to migrate in the next 3 years, it would mean well over 200 million migrants moving towards the United States, presumably, in the next 3 years, equivalent to 2/3 of the US population, which is clearly absurd. When you get the slides, in some cases I've referenced the material that I'm quoting here, so anyone who wants to look it up can do so. So let's have a look at some of the background. First, it's important to say that Nicaraguans have always migrated. I think there was a census figure that showed that at various times over 1 million Nicaraguans have left the country for work or to live. And half of these had done so before 2018. And officially, we know that 385,000 Nicaraguans live in Costa Rica, and probably the figure is more like 500,000. But many migrate temporarily. Many migrate to work. They work for a few months or a year or two and move back. Some migrate permanently, and the question is, does this really amount to 1 in 10 of the population? Well, let's look first at the United Nations Refugee Agency figures. They're a little bit difficult to interpret because there are different figures at different times. The United Nations Refugee Agency says that 293,000 Nicaraguans are displaced. 3/4 of these are in Costa Rica, and most of the rest are in the US, but there's a scattering in other countries like Spain and Mexico. The UN's global trends figures are a bit higher, 275,000 claims just in 2021 and 2022. But I think these figures are very questionable, and I explained why in an article for COA, the Council on Hemispheric Affairs, because the UN has been double counting the numbers in Costa Rica, and that article explains why. But I want you to look in a little bit more detail at what's happening in Costa Rica. There's no agreement on the figures about the numbers of Nicaraguans claiming asylum, but it seems to be about 200,000 since 2018. A lot of these, I would argue, are not genuine claims. Only a few thousand of them have been approved, and the Costa Rican government says only about 80% are valid. Most are economic migrants trying to regularize their position in Costa Rica. At the time of the pandemic, the Costa Rican government pleaded with Nicaraguans to stay during the pandemic and not leave the country because they were needed for work reasons. But since then, the current president, Chavez, has put restrictions on applications for asylum, arguing that most are economic migrants. There's a large degree of mutual dependency between the Costa Rican and Nicaraguan economies, and this dependency is largely ignored when looking at these issues, unfortunately. Nicaraguans play a key role in the Costa Rican economy. There's an agreement between the two governments about largely low-paid workers being able to move across the border. And indeed, border crossings between the two countries are very large in volume. If you look at the last 12 months crossings registered at the border crossings in Costa Rica, over 290,000 Nicaraguans crossed into Costa Rica, but slightly more came out of Costa Rica. So Nicaraguans travel between the two countries on a very regular basis. In respect of the violent coup attempt in 2018, it's often forgotten that there was an amnesty of all those who'd taken part in 2019. And even those who had committed crimes and had fled the country were allowed to return from Costa Rica. And those who were in prison were released from prison.
Excuse me, John. We need some English interpretation. It just stopped according to a couple of participants.
Okay, shall I pause for a moment?
Yes, please, until we confirm that an interpreter is now available for the English. Jill or Camilo? Okay, it's okay, John, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. And the reality is that many of the Nicaraguans in Costa Rica are now moving towards the US. There are not so many jobs as there used to be in Costa Rica, and people are still going there, but also people are leaving. So my summary about Costa Rica is that of probably around 200,000 people who've claimed asylum over the last 5 years or so, maybe 20% are genuine. And so perhaps 40,000 of these are real asylum seekers from Nicaragua. And I would suggest that was a maximum. But let's move on to look at what's happening with migration to the United States. Before 2021, there was very little migration from Nicaragua. According to the US Census, the Nicaraguan-born population in the US has been steady or even going down. But this changed abruptly in the middle of 2021, when suddenly 13,000 Nicaraguans were apprehended at the border. And since then, some 350,000 encounters with Nicaraguans have taken place at the border. But the numbers of those encountered in 2023 are well below those of 2022. And of course, encounters at the border, the border with the southern border of the United States, are very much more still with people from Mexico or from the northern triangle of Honduras, Guatemala, or El Salvador. These are the encounters during the last fiscal year. And you can see that Nicaragua is quite a way down the list. It forms about 4% of the encounters. And there's a reason for the fall, and it's a change in the border procedures and border policies that took place about a year or so ago. So until January 2023, Nicaraguans were treated under what's called Title 8 of US migration law, and they were allowed into the US. Then after January 2023, they were treated like most other migrants under Title 42 and were subject to expulsion. But at the same time, this system of humanitarian parole was introduced. You can see from these overall figures in the chart that apprehensions at the border fell markedly at the beginning of 2023. And that's because of these policy changes that took place, which I'll speak more about. The border encounters specifically with Nicaraguans since 2020, you can see in this chart. And as you can see, in 2020, there were almost none. And then it went up very sharply in subsequent years. And it peaked at the very beginning of 2023, but that's then fallen back, not quite to its original levels, but not far short of them. And the issue is, was this because of the change to Title 42, or was it because of humanitarian parole being introduced? And this chart shows just the figures for Venezuelans, Cubans, Haitians, and Nicaraguans. The Nicaraguans don't show up very well because they're a small number in these charts. But basically what happened was that numbers of all of these nationalities fell sharply at the beginning of this year with the change in border policies. And whilst the numbers of Venezuelans have increased again, numbers of Nicaraguans have stayed low. But there are various migrant encounters, and I was going to talk about the different kinds of encounters, but I think I'm going to run out of time, so I'll leave this slide and move on to the next one, and people can have a look at it if they want to afterwards. But I think the main, coming back to the myths issue, we have to address these questions. Is this migration taking place because of repression and because of alleged communism in Nicaragua? According to the State Department, with what we're seeing in Nicaragua is escalating climate of repression, fear, and hopelessness. And you can see various other quotes there saying the same thing. But I would argue that people are leaving mainly for economic reasons. Nicaragua is part of the dry corridor running through Central America. It's shown purple on that map. And the dry corridor is the region where agriculture has become more difficult because of climatic conditions. There are fewer job opportunities in Costa Rica, as I mentioned, and there are plentiful jobs in the United States. There's the factor of US sanctions and the threat of more sanctions, which was highlighted as a factor driving migration in a recent program on Democracy Now! And as we've said, the US has made entry easier for Nicaraguans. So I don't think that Nicaraguans are fleeing repression. Whatever they say when they reach the US border, practically all the migrant stories I've heard are about jobs, because illegal work is easily available. There's little risk once you reach the US. Coyote networks to help people get to the States have been plentiful since 2021. And there is unrelenting propaganda here pushing people to migrate, and particularly to adopt or apply for humanitarian parole, which is an emotive term in itself. This only applies to 4 Latin American countries plus Ukraine. And sponsored people under this scheme, if accepted, are given permission to work in the US for 2 years. There are 30,000 places each month, and now there's a big backlog of applications. And those who are accepted under the scheme can travel to the US normally. So we've seen a big campaign here in the so-called independent media, which means the right-wing media, and by the US Embassy on social media. Promotional videos, almost daily instructions in the independent media. We've seen that Nicaraguans crossing the border illegally have fallen very sharply. Out of 270,000 parole arrivals by October this year, 48,000 were Nicaraguans. Although Nicaraguans don't feature very large in the backlog of applications, as you can see from that chart at the bottom of the screen. I was going to talk a bit about an example of the son of a friend of mine who traveled north several months ago and what he experienced. I think perhaps I'll leave this as we're a bit short of time, and if there's time again, I might come back to it and talk about it later. So I'll skip those 2 slides, but just on this slide, you can see the long journey that people take who go by land. It's over 4,000 kilometers. And the first 1,000 kilometers to the border between Guatemala and Mexico is relatively easy because it can be done by bus. And that's when the coyotes take over to cross the border into Mexico and supposedly to shepherd people through Mexico, although in this case, there were some severe disadvantages to the coyote system, which I could explain. Before I finish, I'll mention something briefly about the position of migrants who are passing through Nicaragua. There are large numbers passing through Central America to get to the US, and it's said that over 400,000 have crossed from Nicaragua into Honduras so far in 2023. In the last 3 years, the coyote system in Nicaragua has existed in order to facilitate this movement. And of course, some Nicaraguans have taken advantage of it too. In Panama and Costa Rica, migrants now have to pay for bus travel across the country, and they're effectively imprisoned until they can catch these buses. They were put into migrant camps. But from Nicaragua northwards, migrants use normal public transport. Some also arrive directly in Nicaragua by air. For some time, they've been arriving from Cuba, and recently they've been arriving from Haiti. and from some African countries where there's no visa requirement in Nicaragua. And the US has accused Nicaragua of weaponizing migration and has imposed sanctions on airlines that are using Nicaraguan airports to transport people. But it hasn't taken any sanctions against transport operators in Costa Rica or Panama, nor has it sanctioned El Salvador, which has a similar arrangement, but charges much higher entry fees of over $1,000 for people who land in El Salvador with the idea of moving northwards. My conclusion is that Nicaraguans have always migrated. Yes, it's true that they're probably doing so more at the moment than they have in the past, but I believe that the numbers are much fewer than 1 in 10. Maybe not as low as 1 in 20, but something in between, and certainly not a tenth of the population. Are they moving because of repression? In almost all cases, I think no, they're not moving because of repression, whatever they may say if they are forced into making asylum claims when they arrive in Costa Rica or in the US. The reality is that the United States is draining Nicaragua of its brightest young people, as it's doing also in Cuba and Venezuela. And opposition media are encouraging people to go, and they're aided and abetted in this by the US Embassy and the US authorities. Thanks.
Thank you so much, John, for your presentation. It was really enlightening, and I appreciate that you are helping us engage with the actual numbers directly. And I also appreciated your explanation of humanitarian parole. It sounds quite pernicious, actually, when, thinking about the conditions that Venezuelan, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and other migrants are living in the United States. I'm speaking from New York right now, and New York City, the Adams administration has really poorly treated the Venezuelan migrants in the city. And I shudder to think what is in store for Nicaraguans as they travel to the United States. So to provide an additional dimension of the situation for Nicaraguans in the United States, I'm pleased to introduce our second speaker, Lenin Munguía, who migrated to Maryland in the United States 3 months ago from Managua through the humanitarian parole program. In Nicaragua, he worked as a musician and photographer, and he also worked for a land title company. He is here to share his firsthand experience being a recent migrant to the United States. Welcome, Lenin. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon once again, and greetings to everyone, and in gratitude. My status as a migrant on parole is quite different than what happens to many other friends and acquaintances who I know who crossed the border on bus and going through all of the countries of Central America, who had major problems in Mexico with the problems in Mexico, and then getting to the United States. Now, of course, it is an open door policy because there's a way to say that they say Nicaragua has major political problems when many people came, above all because of the opportunities here, the opportunity to come here, the American dream. And once again, I know that it's not a dream. It's a matter of coming into free slavery. But the difference from my case is that I've come under different conditions. I didn't pay anything except for my work permit. That's all that I had to pay for, and as well as my travel expenses plus other things, because too many people are going to Nicaragua, and it's not because I didn't come here for political reasons. Obviously, I have always said, and I've said it to people here, the first thing they say, oh, you came from Nicaragua, oh, you had to escape Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega is working in the country. A lot of people who came as well under parole conditions or what we heard before, they're people who worked for the government or people who worked in other institutions and who decided to come up here to earn more money. And later, you're under the conditions in which you're invited to apply for asylum. They say that you can apply for political asylum, and what you have to say, a lot of people say they do this, they just apply for asylum because they're invited to. So in my condition and my working conditions and the experience that I've had in the little more than 3 months that I've been here, I decided to come up here. I am not politically persecuted, and I say this to everyone who I meet. I came of my own will, and I quit a job that I had because I was earning $500 a month in Nicaragua, and I can earn that much in a lot less time here. But the problem isn't so much of how much you earn, it's whether you're going to change your ideas and your thinking, because the system here makes you change. I've spoken with Eduardo about my experience. Unfortunately, the direct labor exploitation comes from Latinos themselves who exploit our labor in this country. So there is exploitation and labor prostitution because they sell us out. They sell us, and there are Latino contractors who do this with migrants. And the same thing in with the rent of apartments and houses, renting a room. It's the Latino landlords again. So the system changes people. It begins to change your concept, your ideas, and they begin to spread the word about this. They say that you're escaping communism, that the president of your country is this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of people who are up here have received benefits from the government. But since this system encourages that, people are afraid to say that I'm a Sandinista, for example. People are very afraid to say that. And I don't understand why, because at the end of the day, that's your thinking. Supposedly here we're in the great country of freedom and democracy. Is it true that democracy exists here? So discussing this with some young people, we've had some, in a little over 3 months that I've been here, I'm left with some distasteful experiences, but the system is going to say, but you can see Latinos who are exploiting our labor. I don't know whether anyone would like to ask me any questions about this, but as far as what John was explaining, and they say the count us as Nicaraguans, but coming from Venezuela, they go through Colombia, they get to Panama, and a lot of people, a lot of friends and acquaintances who worked in Panama quit their stable jobs to come to the United States. And since they had open borders, and they said, okay, if the borders are open, we're going to go. And people see this as a new opportunity. The same in Costa Rica. People who are working in Costa Rica, near where I live, they came to Nicaragua to get on a bus and migrate and get up to the U.S. border. I know that it is partially for political reasons, because for people to migrate like this, and they do have problems in Nicaragua. They say in Nicaragua there are problems. But as I've told lots of people, I've been here for 3 months now. During those 3 months that I've been here, the country's been stable. I was more stable where I was. It was my own decision. No political party or government obliged me to make this decision, and we don't have lies about it. What we have here are mercenaries working in the media. They're communications mercenaries who say lies, and unfortunately we do have a problem up here. People get on social media and they see it's like you get it's like a horse with blinders on who can't see what's in the next lane. Generally speaking, in this country, in my country, people get on social media, or rather anti-social media, and that's what contaminates our brains. Just recently, I was working, and somebody came up from saying, "What? Look what your government's doing. They're confiscating property from the people who are migrating." And I'm saying, "How are you confiscating this? Because I don't have anything down there. What are they going to take away from you?" So this is it's just another form of lies. The confiscation law that so there's always manipulation. And also, let's give one of the latest examples of manipulation, and which is why, coincidentally, the day before yesterday, I saw that on a Mexican news channel, Univision. It's a Mexican and from the United States, and people were talking about Miss Universe, and that the regime is persecuting Miss Universe. And right now, they're trying to grab that person and politicize her. But the issue of migration and everything that's happening, I was down there. As John says, maybe 10% of the people migrating are for political reasons, but the rest are not. I can tell you that the most people I know are not migrating for political reasons. Many of us have seen an opportunity, so we said, "Oh, well, we'll try." And for me, because my mom and my brother are up here, and they said, "Okay, we'll see if we can get it for you," and they got it. So I said, "All right, I'll go try it out." And also, one of the things that you can't be is saying things that you don't know about. For example, to say you have to live the experience in order to be able to have an opinion about something. We have to have this lived experience. And with parole, it's quite different. Many people say that it's a privilege. How fortunate for you. Well, it's not really luck, it's privilege. And you can't rely on luck or privilege, because in the end of the day, whatever you experience living here is not what you imagined when you're living down there. So perhaps we're lucky to be alive and privileged to have your life and your health, because in this country, it's prohibited to get sick. You can't get sick in this country. If you don't work, you don't eat. If you don't work for 1 or 2 weeks, you have to pay the rent. You have to pay for a bunch of things. And if you don't pay it in proper time and form, you get kicked on the street. And unfortunately, it's Latino people who are going to do that to you, in my experience, because they've really messed up a lot of people. There are a lot of people I know here who I am in touch with who have had weeks of pay stolen from them because they don't have work permits, and they say they're illegal. And people don't understand that even though they're illegal, they have rights, and they can sue any contractor. Because as I was telling you, you do have some legal standing, because along the border, they let you in. So there's also, you get treated differently when you're under parole. But I don't know how I'm doing with time. Could somebody let me know how I'm doing with time, please?
You've only gone about 7 minutes so far. Keep going.
Solo han pasado 7 minutos, así que tienes más tiempo.
Sí, tienes como 7 minutos más. Sí.
All right. All right. So with our experience with the kids, young people I've spoken, it's very sad to hear the stories of so many people when you're at work and you're a new person. Also, you're the new naive person, the new dummy, and it's not that you're just there accepting everything, but you begin to realize and hear the stories of so many people, how you get paid here, in the construction industry. There are contractors that only pay you $12 an hour, and if you and they say you have to work because we know you have to pay the rent, you have to pay for a roof over your head, and it's very expensive, and the wages leave you in poverty, places that don't have heat, and 3 or 4 people living in a room, and you get charged $350 or $400 per person to share a room that reeks of mold. And who owns those houses or who rents them out to you? It's a bunch of Latinos renting this out to migrants. So sometimes it's even people from our own country, and they take advantage of the new migrants coming in, and they exploit our labor, and they rob us, they attack us with the rent. And but what can you do? You just say, where can I turn? But unfortunately, that is the situation. In my experience, in the 3 months that I've been in this country, I have had these bitter experiences with Latinos. And even along the way, I met some very good people and people who also are in the struggle, working for us, earning their wages. They extend a hand, but also the the worst in this country are the alleged contractors. They know that you don't speak the language. That's another hurdle. But you have to learn the language so that we don't get screwed by these peoples, because that's one of the problems. If you don't speak English, they can take advantage of you. And so the contractors do whatever they want. So it is very sad. And it sounds ugly, but this is the reality. And I've had more of the bad experiences with Latinos.
I don't know if anybody would like to ask a question, or maybe at the end we'll have Q&A at the end. Or if you would like me to clarify that not all of us who come here are political persecuted people, because that never existed in Nicaragua. In Nicaragua, we never had people persecuted politically. In 2018, the news were so absurd and people would believe that. But since I was talking to some friends yesterday, when will a dictator will allow a child to tell him to yell barbarities in his face? A dictator will immediately disappear him. So they started saying all these kinds of things and lies. The creation of mercenaries in communication, that's the first thing here. To make up a lot of so-called journalists who are not journalists, and all the fake news that are put in people's heads, which are only in social media, because a lot of people are using YouTube and TikTok, and the YouTubers, those people are getting into all kinds of political messes. But yes, the migration in Nicaragua, I'm not going to say everyone, but some people have come, but most people, many people, I know people who have been 2 years and they already want to go back. They met their goal. Others say, no, stay longer. No, I already got what I wanted. I'm leaving. I'm tired. In 2 years, 2 years, 3 years of being here, working without papers, never had a work permit. The business of the fake permits here, the chuecas as they call them, which is other Latinos doing that. As I said, this country has savage corruption just like our country is, because they know that you're working with a fake work permit, and the companies, they still hire you. It's part of the corruption to allow people to work with fake papers. That's in my brief time here, I've seen too much. I feel like I've lived here 5 years and I still have a lot of stuff to see.
Well, thank you, Lenin, for your presentation. I think you gave us a much more graphic picture of what it's like to be a new migrant to this country, even under so-called humanitarian parole, which doesn't sound very humanitarian to me. And it sounds like you've had a difficult time in spite of the fact that you came here legally through this program. So now we have plenty of time left for questions and answers for our two speakers. It looks like we have about 20, at least 20 minutes for questions and answers. So please, if you have not already, continue putting your questions for both of these speakers in the Q&A area. And Michelle Munjanat and I will take turns posing questions to the speakers. So here is the first question, which is for Lenin. I'm wondering, what is it that you miss most about your country? And what when you think about Nicaragua right now, what are the things that you miss the most?
Well, what I miss the most and I always think about is family. Because as I said in the beginning, oh, how lucky, what a blessing. No, there's no luck. In the end, it's a decision that you made, and the first thing that you leave behind is your family, right? That's one of the hardest parts of migration, at least those who love their families. That's one of the hardest things. And also, of course, leave your country behind. You always say it's nothing's like being in your own country. No, my own little house, I'm at peace. Well, yes, humble, but I'm not worried about being evicted because I didn't pay rent. No, it's my home. Here, you pay 100 years and you won't own your home. And that's the lie, as I was saying to the compañera here. They they show us the grass as if it's the carrot, and you go after it. And with that, you have enough. And there, you forgot everything, the whole rest, and you don't see other things. Yes, you miss your home, your family, your country, because the warmth, the human warmth that we have in our countries, despite everything that's going on. Nicaragua has gone through a lot of things. We are one of the countries that has gone through wars, earthquakes, hurricanes, lots of things. So it's made us, it's made the people, it's hardened the people, it's made people stronger. Besides that, people are very sensitive, also very friendly. Here, I was surprised the first few days. You come here with your customs from your country. Wow, you open the door, somebody comes in, somebody says, no, 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 don't open the door, don't help that person, because if they fall, they're going to sue you, they're going to charge you money. Damn. These are things that you culturally, the cultural shock and all those things that say, damn, and then you start missing more. I've always loved my country, and as I've always said to people, I don't have to leave my country to say that I love Nicaragua. If you had, I don't even bring anything that says I'm Nicaraguan because it's in my heart. I don't have to shout it out because my country, I carry it here and here because I've done it from there. There are a lot of people who do it because as soon as they travel, they say, oh, my country. No, 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 not me. I'm clear. I'm from the land of where the man who put the boot in the other man's neck to the Yankee, that Sandino's boot on the Yankee's neck. Sometimes I tell people we have to let these thieves know, these people who are stealing from us, who is which was the boot of Sandino, and also the land of Ruben Darío, the prince of the Castilian language, the Spanish language. We have to be proud of our country. But yeah, you miss your family. That's one of the first things that you think about, your family. And well, the living with your friends, you know, the whole lifestyle that you left behind.
Thank you, Lenin. We have a question from Jamila. Do you think because you were educated by a socialist government, it is easier for you to spot these real contradictions?
Well, yes. Well, the thing is that also, yes, it's what we have lived. It's what we have lived. And we have found out being there. A lot of people tell me when you're there, you're going to change and you're going to see things from a different angle. No, because the system is there. The system is not going to change. And the system doesn't have to change me. If I'm here, okay, I'm working. I mean, I am a slave in my freedom. I am a free slave, right? Because here everything is imposed. You pay for everything. And they're not gonna tell you, make you deny your country. You have to see the things for yourself. I don't have to fall in love with an iPhone or with a tall building and not realize the reality. There's poverty here. There are people here asking for food on the streets, people sleeping in the streets in this horrible cold that you never get used to. You see people like that. You say, where's the beauty? Where's the pretty stuff? What happened to all of that? And I don't know. I've seen a lot of people who are not working. They're being supported by other people and they just smoke marijuana. But the Latin people, they have to work here. The migrant has to, you know, work when they come here. So no, maybe perhaps I have these concepts because besides that I'm part of a party which is contrary to what a lot of people or what a system is saying, maybe that's why. And not only because you change your political ideology, but you don't have to change your personality and forget that you're a migrant. Forget that one day you came here with nothing to this country, and that if you achieve something, to mistreat and exploit people. Because I'll remember that one day, I'll remember that as a migrant, I was once exploited, I was cold, I was hungry, I suffered a lot of things. So you can't change that concept and say that, okay, people will suffer because I suffered. No, that doesn't have to happen. No, it's not only about your political education, but also your education in your family. And there are a lot of things. And yes, the socialism, I was born in 1980, right? And it was a time when I always remember that we had to share. We had to share. I was little, but then you start growing and you start saying, them also in my block. This was the reality. People shared. In the 90s, right? In the 90s, people were each fighting for their own. Everybody was fighting for their own interests. If you died of hunger, I didn't care. I could see you, but I had to accumulate, and people became consumers. And so the good thing about socialism and communism, which they attacked so much, it was lost because of a system that privatized things, individualistic system for people to become rich despite what happens to others. If others are not living well, I have to take from them. Maybe that's why I think in this way and I see things in this way. I could be here in the United States, England, anywhere. I'm not going to change my thinking because I know what the world has suffered and many countries in the world have suffered and are suffering. One example right now, what's happening in Palestine. Putin was a killer because he got into Ukraine, but what the Israelis are doing in Palestine, it's nothing. we don't need to have an education to see those things. We just have to be human. If we are human beings, I'm not going to say that because this is a holy land, they have the right to kill innocent people. In this wars, they're killing children, they're killing innocent people. War is not good, but here a lot of people say yes. They're businesses. And so maybe there are other things that have made me look at things the way that I look at things.
Thank you, Lenin, for that wide-ranging response. Very, very interesting. The next question is actually directed at John Perry. I believe, John, that you say that you have another story that you could share about a migrant that you wanted to tell us about.
Yes, sure, Barbara. This is a young man, a bit like Lenin, called Alejandro, who's the son of a friend of ours. And he left for the States about a year ago. He paid a coyote $6,300 to get him and a group of people from a town near to Masaya to and across the Texas border. And they traveled north on the bus through to Guatemala, and then they spent about 10 days crossing Mexico by car, and finally ended up in a so-called safe house near to the Rio Grande. And then there were half the group were women and half were men. The women were sent off to cross the river by themselves or within a bigger group of women. They crossed and entered the US. But the men, the five men, were kept in the safe house, and then they were told that they could only leave if they collectively paid another $7,000. So the five of them had to make contact with their family in Nicaragua again, get them to borrow money again, in order effectively to pay a ransom of just over $1,000 each. And they were given a week to raise this money. They managed to raise it. And then they were taken across the river. They went across in a group of about 20 who were roped together to cross the river. And then the coyote handed them to the US immigration officials once they crossed the river. And obviously there was an arrangement between the coyote and the officials, because the coyote wasn't taken away or arrested or anything. And so Alejandro applied for asylum like the other Nicaraguans did. He had no reason to apply for asylum. He didn't want asylum. He only wanted to work. And he has been working for the last year. But he very soon wanted to come back to Nicaragua, but he can't come back until he's earned enough to pay his debts, the debts that were incurred by his family in order to send him. And he's enduring the same conditions that Lenin mentions, very difficult places to live and work. He's working as a roofer, constructing roofs in cold weather, in hot weather. And he's pretty miserable and wants to go back to Nicaragua as soon as he can. And I think we'll come back in the next year or two. So I think that story is probably a bit like Lenin's, only, or the stories that Lenin has heard from other people who've crossed illegally. And I've heard many stories like that. And a lot of people have applied for asylum because that's a way of staying in the US. But they don't need to apply for asylum because they weren't persecuted politically when they were in Nicaragua.
Thank you, John. I think there are a few questions that are of a similar theme. So I'm going to try and combine them and pose it to the speakers. All right, so there's a question about poverty in the United States versus in Nicaragua, and where it would be worse. And generally, I think this has kind of been alluded to, but what is missing in Nicaragua that migrants are leaving or claiming asylum to enter the United States? So maybe I'll have John answer followed by Lenin.
Well, to answer the first part first, obviously, Nicaragua is one of the poorest countries in Latin America, so wages here are very low. And people see that wages are higher in Costa Rica, where the economy is 5 times the size of Nicaragua's per person, and obviously much higher in the US. And they're attracted by the prospect of earning more. But many people don't realize, as Lenin said, how much it's going to cost for them to survive in the US. And they forget that here they've got free school and free schools, free higher education, free health service, and so on. Nevertheless, the government here is working hard to develop the economy. It's had the fastest growing economy in Latin America from the pandemic 2020 until this year, and the main setback that it suffered was, of course, everybody suffered because of the pandemic. But before that, in 2018, the economy was very badly damaged by the coup attempt. So really, the government is struggling to bring the economy back from that low point that it achieved then, and back to where we wanted to be. It's already got back to where it was in 2017 and started to grow again. But that will take some time. And I think that, unfortunately, the American dream will still be attractive to people, especially with the parole arrangements, which are easier for people to use if they can get parole than crossing the border illegally.
Lenin?
Okay.
As John was saying, obviously, it is apparent that the countries of Latin America have more extreme poverty. We're the backyard of this country because we realize who has impoverished us. And as people say, what does this country care about Nicaragua? Well, they do have interest in Nicaragua. They want to keep your backyard poor to get them to do whatever you want them to do. So they have allowed and left people, corrupt people in power in our countries. And here people say that over $3 for a gallon of gas in Nicaragua costs that much for 1 liter of gas. Who's guilty of that situation of gas costing more in Nicaragua? Whose fault is it? The people who have sanctioned Venezuela when Chavez was giving us oil, and that really got gas prices to go way down here in Nicaragua because we got cheaper fuel from Venezuela. So now they have unfair competition, and now it's like we're tied to that. So obviously, with our poverty is more extreme than what you have here. There's no discussion. And second, what leads to migration is the same thing, as John was saying. The Nicaraguan economy in 2018 was even 5%, growing at 5%. And when we had our problem of 2018, we had that fell, and then with the pandemic. But then on top of this, we have sanctions. When you sanction this and that person in the government, that means a bunch of people lose their jobs. And we don't see that because the sanctions aren't hurting Daniel Ortega or Rosario Murillo. They're hurting the people of Nicaragua when they impose sanctions. So you begin to break down the scaffolding that you've put together to build a building. So obviously a bunch of people come, and then that leads to unemployment. And private enterprise that was engaged in the attempted coup, they also began to lay people off. And so what happened, the state cannot employ all of Nicaragua. Everyone cannot be a government employee, and that's why we have private enterprise. And also, the states work with the private enterprise is in order to make sure that there are jobs, and they make some concessions. One thing that you have to understand, before 2018, private enterprise had tremendous concessions. They didn't pay taxes under the concessions given by the government so that they could provide jobs to people. But they didn't like the idea of paying 7% out of the 10% of the minimum wage in the country. So that's where private enterprise got involved in all of that trouble and began to work against the government. When the government had been giving them $1 million concessions of not paying taxes so that they could give people jobs, and then they began to lay everybody off. They began firing a bunch of people. And now the government can't give everybody jobs. So that is also something that gets people coming up to the United States. And then you get a lot of friends who call you up and say, come up here, you get so much money, I'll give you where you can live. And so that's, I didn't sell my stuff off, but a lot of people did sell their homes, their cars. They quit their jobs, and when they get up here, the same thing, who told them, come up here, I'll help you out. And then they're saying, look, you have to pay me. If you're not working, you have to leave. You can't stay at my house here. You have to pay for the rent. Oh, but they don't tell you that when you're in Nicaragua. They just tell you how nice it is up here. So that's also very common. A lot of the cases that I know are friends who have gone through that. And as they say, that a guest gets stinky after a month. So you have to leave. You have to go on and live your own life. And it's like a dead person, a dead body gets stinky after a few days. You have to have a vehicle to get around because it's a long ways to get to work, especially if you work on construction projects. They move you from one building in one state and then to another one. For example, I travel an hour and 15 minutes each way to work. And so you spend a lot of money on commuting to work. And then all of a sudden, a criminal might tell you, no, I'm not going to pay you because you didn't do something. But also, what is driving migration is also a lot of people who are deceived. And we do need to be clear on this because a lot of people are told, come up here. And that's what happened with people who were crossing the border, people who got held in immigration. They had phone numbers of people who were going to welcome them here, but they didn't answer their phones. And they told them to come up here, but at the moment of truth, they weren't there for them. So a lot of people trick people and they say, yeah, come up here for the American dream. And then you can come here, you can live in my house, and that's it. But it doesn't go very far.
Thank you, Lenin. And I'm going to direct this next question at John in two parts. Since Lenin already discussed a little bit how sanctions on Nicaragua have affected migration, I wonder, John, if you would like to add anything to that point. And then second, separate question to some extent, as a European man who has lived in Nicaragua for 20 years, can you share with us how the changes that you've seen in Nicaragua during that time between the neoliberal governments and the FSLN government, and how that has affected you, and also how it may have affected the way that you view race now as compared to how you viewed it when you were in the UK?
Let me answer the second question first, and I'll answer it by referring to the place where I live. I live in a small community which is very poor outside Masaya, and obviously in comparison with my neighbours, I'm a millionaire. But I've seen the development of that community. We've had very good contacts with people in the community over that 20-year period. And when we first came, there was a dirt road. The water supply was very, very poor. There was no electricity. And most of the people lived in very tumble down houses. And all of that has changed. There's now a paved road. that goes to Masaya in one direction and out to Masaya in the other direction. The water supply arrives regularly. There's electricity where before there was none, and most people have got reasonably decent houses. And within 2 miles, there's a 24-hour health centre, which is free of charge. So all of these improvements have taken place in the last 16 years. And it really has been quite an astonishing transformation. And if you look at the picture nationally, and talk about the numbers of hospitals, the numbers of roads that have been paved and so on, then it's a remarkable transformation compared with that period of neoliberal government when the whole country was being neglected. To come on to sanctions, I had recently the opportunity to interview Ivan Acosta, who's the finance minister in Nicaragua, and he was explaining the effects of sanctions on the government's projects to assist the poorer communities. And really, the sanctions have deprived Nicaragua of about $500 million a year for the last 5 years from the World Bank and other institutions. And though the projects that would have been financed by that money would have benefited rural communities, poor communities, particularly people living in the dry corridor that I mentioned earlier, would have helped to improve the country's water supply. It would, as he said, have enabled them to build even more new hospitals than the ones that they built during that time. So just on the effects on international finance, the sanctions have been very important, quite apart from what Lenin said about the effects on individuals or on private firms, where there haven't necessarily been direct sanctions, but businessmen react to the fact that there are sanctions and are much more cautious about investment, or decide to invest in another country thinking that the US might sanction them personally for their investments in Nicaragua.
Thank you, Lenin and John, for your answers. I'm going to ask one more question of the speakers before we turn it over to each of you for final thoughts and wrap up the webinar. Very, very good conversation so far. So this is a question for anyone and who would like to answer. How can we, who are Nicaraguan supporters in the United States, help with educating people about the people and NGOs who prey on newly immigrated people?
I would perhaps suggest that Lenin answers that question, because I'm not very familiar with the NGOs in the US.
Well, in reality, I myself, I dare to say, as I say, you shouldn't be afraid to speak, right? Because in the end, nothing happens. But for instance, where I work today, I tell the workers, the people who are there, if I don't see them, that they have equal rights. I'm talking about here, because in Nicaragua right now, to educate people in Nicaragua, you tell them they only understand until they're in the place. That's clear. I call my acquaintances and I say, look, if they give you a fake check, take a picture, sue that person because that's a crime. If they don't pay you, or they don't pay you, just write down their name, the name of the company, and then go denounce them. I always say that, they have labor unions, and if you go talk to them, they can go sue them. I say all those things for them to avoid exploitation. And also, another one of the things that I have said, for them to get paid $16 an hour in this country, it's not a lot. You're worth a lot more in a building, because the building pays you $20 an hour, but the person contracting you, they're earning the difference. They pay you maybe $15, so they earn $5 on top of what you're earning. And so if you multiply that times 8 hours times week, you know, it's a lot. So you have to inform people, inform them, tell them not to be afraid despite not having work permits, because the companies themselves, you know, they evade taxes. That's a crime. They pay you with a check. If you don't have an ID and you don't have a social security, they can pay you with a check because they're doing it because they want to not pay taxes. And so you always have to tell them those things that they don't know. They have bad information, things that would favor you, that work in your benefit, for them to stop being victims of exploitation and theft. I was at a place and I left. I said to the lady, my landlady, I said, look, if I bring the city here, they're going to fine you because people here live like dogs and you are profiting from that. And so she was surprised because she wanted to talk to me. And I said, no, if I call the city, you know, to come here and do an inspection where you're renting out a basement which has cockroaches and rats and all kinds of infestations, you want me to call the city? I will. One of the things that I have used, thanks to being here in Peru, is I'm not a wetback, and people are like, well, I haven't said with Peru, but they think that I have a normal visa. I can come in and out from this country whenever I want. And so when the employer, you tell him or her those things, they become a little bit more afraid. So I've always said to people, no, man, you have to speak out. Those times of you know, calling eyes on you or over, the people who came here through the border, they're legal. It's a way of being legal. So the Miche, who is from union, can tell you more about that. But people are legal once you set foot in the country. And that way, I'm doing it whenever I see Latin people who have been telling me their experiences. This person is a thief, this person exploited me. People are continuing to be subjected to wage theft and things like that. And so I have been speaking with them. And that has worked for me. And I don't know, groups such as yourselves, which we can make something more massive, you know, Latin communities, you know, wherever there's a Latin community, we can share information and people can fight exploitation and stop being fools, because they shouldn't only consume the pretty stuff. They have to learn also, learn a little bit about the laws and the things that benefit them as migrants. And so I don't know, maybe we can form big groups such as yourselves that could be expanded and search the Latin community. That's what I think.
Thank you for that answer, Lenin. I am very much in sympathy with what you said, or what's the word, in agreement with what you said. And I hope that we can work together to advocate more for migrants. And I put something in the chat just now. There is an organization that is, they started in Maryland, but now they are working across 46 states, Casa de Maryland, and they also have an advocacy part, wearecasa.org. Anyway, so any migrants can go there and seek help with advocacy of various kinds, wage theft or whatever it may be. Okay, so we are nearing the close of our time. This has been a very lively discussion, I think, and I thank both of the speakers. And I'm wondering whether we might have a final word from each of you. Can we start perhaps with John and then end with Lenin, and then Michelle, you can also offer any final comments.
Thanks, Barbara. I think the point I want to emphasize is that clearly the US needs young workers. And that's why migrants are going there, principally for that reason. but it also has a political reason for encouraging migration from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, which is to be able to label those countries and those governments as repressive. And it's using that terminology very successfully, I guess. You can see this most obviously in the fact that the arrangement that Lenin came to the US on is called humanitarian parole, as if the US is offering, kind of relaxation of prison conditions to people who live in these countries. It's an absurd and very emotive term, and I think a horrible description of the arrangement. But the aim really is also, I think, to as a form of brain drain in these countries. It's more obvious in Cuba, where I was recently. It's a bit less obvious in Nicaragua, but certainly in the last few years, many Nicaraguans doing good jobs. Like Lenin, they had work before they left to go to the United States, have gone for the American dream. And this is really affecting the country because it's affecting even Sandinista government directly and Sandinista municipalities. And really, I suppose my concluding point is it links it back to a question that came about sanctions. Encouraging migration in this way is another form of sanction. It's kind of yet another type of sanction on the country. You take out the brightest and best young people, and that's a way of damaging the country. And unfortunately, the US is doing that successfully here, and perhaps even more successfully in Cuba and Nicaragua. And it's very sad that that's happening.
Lenin?
Well, first of all, thank you all for the invitation, and also to thank you for the organization you have. And also, we're talking about Nicaragua, my country, the place where I was born and was raised. Up until 3 months ago, I stopped drinking pinolillo. And yes, it's important, as I've always said, the experience is very useful to me. This experience is very useful to me. When I go back to Nicaragua, I will be more solid in my thoughts, my ideas. And that I have known that this is political. This is political. Watch out also. The political part in my country can start thinking in more detail, because the government is doing amazing things, great things, great things, great things. But the political part has to be, if the government is here, the political part has to go together so that these things don't break easily. In 2018, it was broken because it was like this. And so it's become more regulated, but well, these subjects of migration, which have been around to Costa Rica, to Panama, other countries in Central America, and now more in the United States, because they opened the floodgates, they gave the opportunity, because obviously this is political, but a lot of people say, let's take advantage of that opportunity. And that's where many of us have left our jobs, others better jobs than mine, which I said, well, if I had been in, if I'd had that job, I wouldn't have come. But it's not that I think that I'm going to be here. I'm going to be here the time I was allowed, 2 years. With that, it's more than enough time to learn a lot of things, to realize a lot of things. Then when I return to my country, my life experience, I'm going to share them as I share them here. And I have to take advantage, if they take advantage of us, let's take advantage of them. Even though if we leave our skin and sweat, let's take advantage of all these experiences and divulge and say the things that we have lived. Here it's not all rosy. This is not ham, as this woman said to me. This is not ham. But there are a lot of people who say, yeah, this is, no, that's not true. A lot of people don't tell the bad stuff, only the good stuff, because we also have to appear in our countries that we're not doing well when we are in bad shape. I have lost weight in 3 months. I have lost 4 pounds, and things that, you know, in my country where supposedly there's no food and there's hunger, I was bigger, I was better fed. But yeah, this is all political. It's how they're attacking this. The only political fools who were sent for free by plane. A lot of people had to pay to come here, but these people didn't have to pay. Those are the ones who are here making a mess, you know, making noise. I've always said no bourgeois class ever has made a revolution. Only the people. With that, I close and thanking you all for this.
Well, thank you, John and Lenin, for your presentations and for your honesty. You know, in hearing what you've shared, it makes me reflect on the fact that Nicaragua doesn't have a broken social fabric. You know, Lenin, when you're in the United States, that's when you're really sensing for the first time a feeling of privation from basic human necessities. You know, you don't have food to eat. You're living in poor living conditions, maybe similar to what people are living in under Somoza, actually. And it, you know, you're really isolated. It's an alienating feeling to be forced to migrate to the United States. So I very much appreciate both of your presentations, and I'll turn it over to Barbara.
I just want to thank all of you for attending today and participating in such a lively exchange with all of us. Sorry that we couldn't get to all of your questions. There were some very good ones that are remaining here, and perhaps we can figure out another way of answering some of those, either through our coalition, posting things on the website, and so forth. So do stay in touch. You can contact us through the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition at gmail.com for an email address, or nicasolidarity.net for the website. And just want to thank all of you for being here and showing your interest and support for Nicaragua and its sovereignty. Okay, bye for now.
Thank you, Barbara.